Shavua Tov. Today's daf is Nun Dalid. We're going to start on Nun Gimel Amid Beis, Lema Kitanoi, which is approximately 12 lines down from the top. And we're talking about Hezek She'eno Nikar, like if someone passes Truma, or he takes Yayin, he's Menasech the Yayin, he makes it into an Isa Yayin Nesech, or he takes chulin and he mixes it with truma, which is called mitamea. And the question is whether or not he is responsible for a hezek she'eino nikar when there's no physical change in the object. Hamitame v'hamidame v'hamenasech. So he took taharos of his friend and he was mitame it, or he mixed truma and chulin of his friend, or he was menasech yayin of his friend to avodah zarah and made it also bano. According to Rabbi Meir, the first Tana, echad shogeg v'echad mezid chayav. Even if he did it accidentally, unintentionally, he still has to pay. Rabbi Yehuda Omer b'shogeg potur v'mezid chayav. And my lav b'hakam miflagi, the Mar Sover, according to Rabbi Meir, hezek she'eino nikar shmei hezek. And with regard to Nezikin, we have the overriding principle of Adam muad li olam, bein b'mezid, bein b'shogeg, which means that a person who damages his friend even unintentionally has to compensate him for the loss. And that's why Rabbi Meir, under the principle of hezek she'eino nikar shmei hezek, is mechayev him, the masik has to pay, even in a case of unintentional damage. Umar sover, but according to Rabbi Yehuda, hezek she'eino nikar lo shmei hezek, and therefore shogeg is potter. There was a takanas chachamim and a knas, a penalty, a monetary fine that was imposed upon the mezid, even though mikra din, he's not chayav because lo shmei hezek. Amar Rav Nachbar Yitzchak rejects this. The Kuli Alma, everybody agrees, whether it's Rabbi Meir or even Rabbi Yehuda, that hezek she'eino nikar lo shmei hezek, or even Rabbi Meir. And according to the strict letter of the law, even in a case of mezid, he should not be chayiv. The chachamim were mechayiv him, and we understand very well why, according to Rabbi Yehuda, they were only mechayiv him in the case of mezid, because if it's a knas, he only deserves the knas if he was intentional. What does Rabbi Meir hold? V'hacha b'kansu shogeg atu mezid kol miflagi. The Mar Sover, we have to understand Rabbi Meir, and Rabbi Meir's principle is that kansu shogeg atu mezid. The chacham would be mechayev a shogeg because of a mezid. In other words, if we allow him to get away with it in a case of a shogeg, then even in a case of a mezid, he'll claim he was a shogeg. And if we won't be able to prove and establish beyond the shadow of a doubt that he was a shogeg, then he'll be potter. So therefore, by alleviating the responsibility in the case of shogeg, you open yourself up to the possibility that even in the case of mezid, he would really be potter because he's going to claim that he's a shogeg. Therefore, kansinon shogeg otu mezid, umar sover Rabbi Yehuda disagrees, lo kansu shogeg otu mezid. And this is going to be a basic principle of Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. And the Gemara says the following: V'rami de Rabbi Meir ad Rabbi Meir, v'rami de Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yehuda. We're going to quote a brisa in the case of someone who cooked on Shabbos and violated Meleches Bishul, and the brisa is going to record a machlokes between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. And it says the following: V'sanya mavashel b'Shabbos b'shogeg. If he were unintentional, which means one or two things, either he forgot it's Shabbos, or he forgot that Bishul is a malacha, then the halacha is, since he did it b'shogeg, according to Rabbi Meir, which is the opposite of our Rabbi Meir in hezek she'eino nikar, we will only impose a knas, which means we're not allowed to eat the tavshil that was generated by violation of Meleches Shabbos if he was a mezid. However, the implication here of Rabbi Meir is that we don't have a principle of kansu shogeg otu mezid. We're allowed to say that with regard to violation of the Shabbos, as long as we impose a knas and prohibit the tavshil in a case of Masechet, that's fine. We don't have to worry that he'll do it b'Masechet, he'll say he was a shogeg, none of that. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, on the contrary, b'shogeg yochel l'motzoi Shabbos. Even with regard to a shogeg, we have to wait what's called kadesh yasu. In other words, during the course of Shabbos, you're not allowed to eat the tavshil. And it means that even in the case of shogeg, Rabbanan imposed this knas, just that after Shabbos, as long as you wait kadesh yasa, the amount of time it would have taken to cook the food, so he's not benefiting from Shabbos, we have a knas of shogeg atu Masechet. Just listen to my message. So that's called b'shogeg. And b'Masechet, says Rabbi Yehuda, lo yochal olamis. It becomes a chefta d'isura, and even after b'chdei sheyasi, you can never enjoy the benefit of this bishul, and the knas in the case of Masechet goes beyond that of shogeg. But in any event, we see clearly that Rabbi Yehuda maintains the position of kansu shogeg atu Masechet. Rabbi Meir, on the other hand, on the contrary, says lo kansu shogeg atu Masechet. Now, the Brisa quotes a third shita of Rabbi Yochanan HaSandlan Omer, who is even more machmir than Rabbi Yehuda, and he says, "B'shogeg yochel l'motzoi Shabbos lacherim v'lo lo." As far as the mavashal is concerned, who unintentionally violated meleches bishul, he could never eat this tavshil. For a cherim who did not violate meleches bishul, we could be mekil after b'chdei sheyas b'Masechet lo yochel lovis lo hu v'lo lo v'lo lacherim. So the Gemara says, Kasha the Rabbi Meir, Kasha the Rabbi Yehuda. In this price, it's the exact opposite. It seems that as opposed to Hezek Shein and Nikar, where Rabbi Meir took a very strong stand, and Kansina and Shogeg atu Masechet, here in the case of Bishul, just the opposite, and Rabbi Yehuda as well. And the Gemara answers the following: Rabbi Meir ad Rabbi Meir lo kasha, ki konis b'derabbanan. In the cases of Metame, Umenasech, where the Iser is only D'Rabbanan, because on a D'Oraisa level, Hezek Sheino Nikar, Lo Shmei Hezek. And therefore, the entire enterprise of Hezek Sheino Nikar is only a Takonis Chachamim, Divrei Sofrim. And we have a rule with regard to Divrei Sofrim, Tzrichim Chizek Yosem Mishal Torah. So we're going to be more machmir, paradoxically, in a case of a D'Rabbanan than in a case of D'Oraisa, so that people won't come to be mezalzel in an Isur D'Rabbanan. And therefore, in the case of Hezek Shein and Nikar, Rabbi Meir maintains that Kansina and Shogeg atu Masechet. D'Oraisa, in the case of someone who violates Bishul D'Oraisa, lo kanis, Rabbi Meir says it's not something that we can anticipate that people would violate a malacha d'oraisa on Shabbos. We don't need chizuk for that. So the Gemara immediately asks the following question: Menaseh v'menaseh d'oraisa who? The Isur of Menaseh l'avodah zarah is clearly an Isur d'oraisa v'kakonis, and yet Rabbi Meir says that we impose a penalty of hezek sheino nikar even on a d'oraisa. Don't tell me that hezek sheino nikar, according to Rabbi Meir's chumrah of kansin and shogeg atu Masechet, is by virtue of the fact that divrei sofrim tzrichim chizuk. I mean, Menasech is not divrei sofrim, and yet Rabbi Meir applies the principle of kansin and shogeg atu Masechet. And the Gemara answers that mishum chumrah d'avodas kol chavim kaneslei, because he violated one of the three cardinal sins, avodas zara, which was chayev yeharg val yavar, and for that Rabbi Meir is going to impose a very strong knas even on a shogeg. The Rabbi Yehuda lo kasha kilo konis b'derabbanan. According to Rabbi Yehuda, we look and we measure by the chumas ha'isa. The chumas ha'avera here is only the rabbanan in the case of hezek shein and nikar, mitame v'dame v'nasech, and therefore we're going to go light and easy on him, and we're going to only consent him in a case of a mezid. But b'doraisa, a person who is mavashal on Shabbos, and he violates an isa doraisa, we have to be very strong, very hard on him. And kanis, even shogeg. This is kidei laharchiko mi isa doraisa. So the Gemara immediately asks, Masechet doraisa hu velo kanis. Rabbi Yehuda insists that we only impose a knas in the case of Masechet, like medame, in a case of mezid, but not in the case of shogi. We should be machmer in the case of shogi because he violated doraisa. The Gemara answers, Mishum chumra davodaskar mivdal badal minei. Rabbi Yehuda comes up with the exact opposite, the polar opposite svara of Rabbi Meir, whereas Rabbi Meir says we have to consent him stark, very hard on him in the case of Odazar because of the chumas avera. And Rabbi Yehuda says, you know what? There's a built-in repulsion, mivdal badal minei, from avodah zarah. People understand very well how chamerdik this Isur of avodah zarah is. They're misrachik from by themselves. We don't have to impose a super duper knas in the case of shogeg. But now we go into the sugya of shvius. And Rabbi Meir ad Rabbi Meir b'doraisa. We're going to have a case of a doraisa, which has to do with the violation of the Isur Shvius, when the Torah prohibits you from working the land on the 7th sabbatical year. And again, we're going to have a contradiction between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Meir, because we saw that Rabbi Meir applies the principle of lo gazrinon, lo kansinon, shogeg to mezin in a doraisa. And yet, this sign you have a brisa that records Rabbi Meir's shita in the reisha of this brisa, notea b'Shabbos, b'shogeg yekayim b'mezid yakor, but of b'shvius bein b'shogeg bein b'mezid yakor to Rabbi Meir. A person violated on Shabbos meleches notea, one of the 39 melachos, and according to the shita of Rabbi Meir, in a case of a doraisa, we don't have to make a chizuk and impose a knas that he shouldn't be able to have any benefit from the neta, from that which he planted, in a case of a shogeg. And therefore, Rabbi Meir says, b'shogeg yekayim. Up until this point, everything makes sense. But Rabbi Meir goes ahead and he says, what about an otea b'shvius, which is a violation of an Isur Torah? And yet, Rabbi Meir says, bein b'shogeg bein b'mezid yakor, we're not going to allow him to benefit from the violation of shvius through this neta. And here we see that Rabbi Meir applies the principle of kansina and shogeg to mezid, even in the case of a doraisa, as opposed to what he said in the case of a violation of Meleches Shabbos, whether it's bishul or notea. And Rabbi Yehuda Omer b'shvius b'shogeg yekayim b'mezid yakor, u'b'Shabbos bein b'shogeg bein b'mezid yakor. So we have here the sheet of Rabbi Yehuda that if he was notea b'shvius b'shogeg, we can let him get away with it, but b'mezid yakor we have to uproot that netia. Shabbos, Rabbi Yehuda is machmer bein b'shogeg u'bein b'mezid, and that is similar to Rabbi Yehuda's shita that we had before, that b'doraisa in the case of a vashal b'Shabbos konis shogeg to mezid, and here too in a violation of Shabbos is bein b'shogeg bein b'mezid. Again, we'll have to figure out why Rabbi Yehuda is mekil and shogeg in the case of shvius. The Gemara now, in order to answer this kasha of Rabbi Meir ad Rabbi Meir, let's look at the brisa itself. L'tamech, the makshon you're trying to prove from the fact that Rabbi Meir holds that b'shvius, bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid yakor, it's because kansin and shogeg are to mezid. But tikshalach gufa michtei hamid deraisa. What about Netiya b'Shabbos, which is one of the malachos of Shabbos, violation of a doraisa. Ma'ishna Shabbos, ma'ishna shvius. Why is it that in the case of Shabbos, we're going to say the b'shogeg lo kain sinon, and yet in the case of shvius, in the case of shogeg kain sinon? So we have an inner contradiction in Rabbi Meir, even before you ask stiras. But the end of this price adds an explanation in which Rabbi Meir makes the following statement. Number of Meir, what does this mean? So first of all, we have to point out that the Isa Netiya on Shvius was not well known amongst the Amcha, amongst the rank and file citizens. There were many who didn't even know about the Isa Netiya and Shvius. So we have to avoid a situation that might lead to people mistakenly concluding that you're allowed to plant during Shvius. Now, every Netiya is subject to the law of Arla and Ravai. First 3 years, Osmanov. Fourth year, you have to bring it to Yerushalayim, like Masechet, etc. And you have to count from the time of Netiya, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, and then the fourth year for Ravai. Now, if we're going to allow him, argues Rabbi Meir, to be Makayim the Elon, that he was Notea b'Shvius, people are going to start thinking that, you know what? You're allowed to be Notea b'Shvius. Now, how do they know that this Netiya was b'Shvius? Because they're counting for Shnos HaOrla. So they know exactly when the Netiya took place. That's like public knowledge. And certainly the Notea himself is aware of that. So he's marking off 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, and he knows that the Netiya itself was during Shvius. And if that's public knowledge, then because of the ignorance of Shvius, it might lead to a very uncomfortable situation where people think that you're allowed to be Notea b'Shvius. However, and here we turn to Daf Nun Daled Amud Aleph, v'ein monim l'shabbosos. There's no need whatsoever to know what day of the week it is that he made the Netiya is. Was it on a Sunday, a Monday, a Tuesday, and so forth and so on? So you know what? Even if he's Makayim the Netiya, nobody's going to know, nobody's going to remember that Netiya was on Shabbos. It doesn't say on top of the Netiya, this was planted on Shabbos, but there is almost a sign that this was Netiya on Shvius. Now the Gemara explains in a different alternative way how Rabbi Meir is machalik between Shabbos and Shvius. Nechshedu Yisrael Shvius. Shvius, he says Shvius was kal b'eineim, and there were a lot of people who are lenient about Shvius, and therefore we have to take a very harsh response and institute a knas, even in the case of shogeg, to avoid zilzul v'isa Shvius. But lo nechshedu al Shabbosos. Shabbos is chamura b'einehem. There's no chash that if we allow him in a case of shogeg to enjoy the benefit of that Netiya, that he's going to come to violate an Easter Shabbos. So there was no need for a knas. So Gemara says, "My dover acher." What was wrong? What was lacking in the first explanation that you needed and you were compelled to offer an alternative explanation? And Gemara says the following: Hachi kamar. This is what Reb Meir meant to say. V'chi tema. And if you'll argue that no, don't differentiate between Shvius and Shabbos because of Shvius Yisrael monim l'Shvius ve'monim l'Shabbosos, because Shabbos nami. Even with regard to Shabbos, we have to be choshesh that people will know when and which day of the week this Netiya was planted. Because sometimes a person needs to count days, even for Netiyas, to know whether or not the Tosefes Shvius period of time passed. So now we're counting days. How many days do we have to count? Zimnin de Mikla Yom Shloshim b'Shabbos. So we have to count 30 days before Rosh Hashanah. Let's say from Rosh Chodesh Elul, we have to already be careful about the Tosefes Shvius. And therefore, we're already calculating days at that period of time. Dinotahu Yoma, hu de Salkale Shata, ve'ilo lo Salkale Shata. If he planted the tree on that day that Shabbos was the completion of a shana for the cheshbon of Orla, and if he hadn't planted it until after Shabbos, then that year would not be Ola Leminyan Shnosa Orla, because he's standing right there. Now, when he calculates for the Elon that this is the Shnas HaNetiyah for the cheshbon of the new year of Orla, then it's public knowledge that he did the Netiyah on Shabbos, because they know that Shabbos is the new year. And therefore, they're going to come to assume that you're allowed to be Noteh b'Shabbos. And therefore, Rabbi Meir's first explanation is inadequate. Tashma dover acher. Therefore, we have to offer an alternative explanation. Nechshadu yisal shviyas v'lo nechshadu al hashabbos. So that's as far as Rabbi Meir is concerned. And it means that in Rabbi Meir's frame of reference, even though shviyas is doraisa, there's exception to the rule, and kansina and shogig or to mezid, for one of two reasons: either because people will come to mizalzel and think that netiyah is mutar shviyas, or because in general people were choshed to be mekel on shviyas. But what about Rabbi Yehuda? Rabbi Yehuda lo kasha. Why is it that Rabbi Yehuda says that if he was noteah b'shviyas b'shogeg, then we're not going to consign him, where in the cases of Shabbos, whether it's mavashal or noteah, Rabbi Yehuda insists that we come down hard on him and consign shogeg or to mezid. And where it says biasid, Rabbi Yehuda chamir leishvis, in Rabbi Yehuda's geged, in his area, his neighborhood, people were very, very machmir about shvius, and we didn't have any chash that if will be mekel in the case of shogeg, and he could be makayim the elon, he'll come to be mekel in shvius. And the Gemara proves this with the following story. In the neighborhood of Rabbi Yehuda, a person said to his friend, Dayor bar daite, ger bar gioris. And why was he using that kind of derogatory phrase? Anolo ach, right? Why was he embarrassing him? Amalei, anolo achli perish shvius kavasech. I don't eat perish shvius like you do. Anyway, you see that his sharp response is a reflection of the fact that shvius was chamura beineim. Toshma, the Gemara now brings up Raisa to prove that Rabbi Meir holds lo kansina and shogeg atu mezid in a dirabanan, which would support our original position in Rabbi Meir about metame menase. Toshma. Achal truma tmeya. Tmeya means even if it was tmeya. And we're talking about a person who eats truma b'shogeg. Now, with regard to eating truma b'shogeg, the Torah says that if he doesn't have money to pay, v'nasan la kohenes hakodesh, a pasuk in Vayikra Chaf Beis, which means that he makes a payment, or let's call it a repayment, of chulin that automatically become truma through the mice of tashlum. In other words, as soon as the ochel truma b'shogeg pays chulin, those chulin automatically become truma. And even though he ate truma tmeya, which is asur b'achila, nevertheless, meshalim chulin tahorin, he still has to replace the truma that he ate with chulin tahorin, but ovar v'shile chulin tmeim out. However, we have machlokas between Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim with regard to a person who paid with chulin tmeim. Because after all, if he paid with chulin tmeim, then basically he's replacing exactly what he took away from the Kohen. Amar Sumchus Rabbi Meir, b'shogeg tashlumav tashlumin, b'mezid ain't tashlumin tashlumin. This entire enterprise here of requiring a payment of chulin that are tahorin is only derabanan. On a doraisa level, since he ate truma tmeya, he could pay back with chulin tmeya. The Rabbanan required that he give chulin tahora. Since he violated the Rabbanan bish shogeg, Rabbi Meir holds, then we can let him get away with it. He's potter. The Masechet, if he deliberately paid with chulin tmeim, violating the Rabbanan that required of him to give chulin tahorim, ain't tashlumin tashlumin. He's going to have to go back and pay with chulin tahorim. The Rabbanan are going to say the following. You know what? Whether he's a shogeg or a Masechet, the payment is a valid payment. In other words, the chulin become truma, because whenever you pay tashlumei truma for eating truma v'shogeg, the tashlumin automatically becomes truma. But however, there's a knas d'Rabbanan that we're going to apply even in a case of shogeg, and that is that he has to replace these chulin tmeim with chulin tahorin. So we have a double halacha. On the one hand, the chulin become truma. On the other hand, he's got to replace that chulin tmeim with chulin tahorin. And we have a kash on this brisa, and that is on the chachamim of the brisa who impose a knas on the ochel b'truma, b'mezid amai ein tashluma tashlumin. Just 1 second. According to the chachamim, it says b'mezid ein tashlumin tashlumin. In other words, what it means is that he did not return tashlumin gruin. Wait a minute. What do you mean? Ain't tashlum of tashlumin tovol bracha? The achal b'nei midi de lo chazi le b'mei tumasa v'komishalim le midi de chazi le b'mei tumasa. He ate truma tmeya of the Kohen. The Kohen's not allowed to eat truma tmeya, even if he's tameh. But he gave the Kohen chulin tmeim. So in his mind, he thinks he upgraded it because now he's giving the Kohen something he's allowed to eat. And now you're telling me, according to the Chachamim, that ein tashluma of, in the case of Masechet, ein tashluma of tashlumin, he thought he was doing the Kohen a favor, he was upgrading it. This is what the Nusach HaBraisa should say. Achal truma tmeya mishalim koldu. Any chulin that he has, even if they're chulin tmeim, he pays him up. Achal truma tahora mishalim chulin tahorin. And then the chulin tahorim, when they give it over to the Kohen as payment, become truma tahora. Shilem chulin tmeim mahu. Sumchas omer mishum Rabbi Meir b'shogeg tashlum tashlumin. The tashlum of chulin tmeim becomes truma tmeya, and he fulfills his obligation because he ate truma tmeya, and now he's replacing it with truma tmeya. However, b'mezid ain't tashlum of tashlumin. The Rabbanan are going to impose a knas because he deliberately wanted to be mafsid the Kohen. Now you might ask, what hefsed is there to the Kohen if he ate truma tmeya? No, I'm sorry. Achal truma tahora, mishalim chulin tahorin, and then he was mishalim chulin tmeim, is then ain't tashlum tashlum because he was miskamin to be mafsid the Kohen. The Kohen had truma tahora, which is mutbachila. Now you gave him chulin tmeim. Whether it's shogeg or Masechet, then tashlum of tashlumin, the pairs are truma, they belong to the Kohen. The Chacham made a knas that he has to be choser mishalim chulin torah. V'yomer Rabbi Acha braid Rav Ika hacha bekonsu shogeg or to Masechet Ika beinayu. Rabbi the Chachamim are arguing here about the din of shogeg, and whether or not we impose a knas in a shogeg case or to Masechet. And now we have a girsa which might not be necessary, but the Rabbi Meir Sover lo kansu shogeg atu mezid hacham omrim kansu. So the Isser to pay Truma Tmeya, which is only Derabanan, in a case where he ate Truma Tmeya, and nevertheless, Rabbi Meir says even in the Derabanan, we don't impose a knas on Shogeg to Mezid. This is against Rabbi Meir, who in the case of Hezek Shen and Nikar said that even in that dafka in the Derabanan, because of the zilzul in Derabanans, we have to impose a knas on Shogeg to Mezid. There's no analogy here. The Hassam, in the case of Tashlume Truma Gavra L'Shlume Kamachame, he's an Adam Kasher. His intention was a good intention. He made a shgaga. He was misasik v'tashlum chova l'truma. So he wanted to be Mekayim the mitzvah of Tashlume Chova l'truma. Now, Anan Nekum V'Linkase, do we want to impose a knas on a shogeg who didn't know that the parents were tmeim? But in the case of Medame, we're going to impose a knas even in the case of shogeg, because the shogeg was not a result of some his askus bedover tov, to be metame something, medame, that's not a dover tov. Binyamin, I'm in the middle of a shir. I'm sorry. Toshma, let's bring a brisa from Masechet Menachos. Dam shenitma, the dam of a korban became tameh, and now you're not allowed to be makriv the korban. And the Kohen went ahead with Zark, and he was Zorik the dam al mizbeach. And we're going to assume that this brisa reflects the Shita Rabbi Meir. Whole discussion here why, but in any event. So b'shogeg hurtza. It means there was a ritzi korban. The korban is kosher. It's machapel bailim based on the halach of tzitz. That tzitz is marapal turmas migdash v'kadosha, and the basar is now mutabach hila. But b'mezid lo hurtza. There's no hechsher for the korban, and you can't eat the basar. And this dam is the oraisa mutal izarkol lechatchila me'achar shatzatz meratze u'mirabanan u'diasol izarkol. And yet, the brisa was mata the basar if the zrika of the dam shenitma was b'shogeg. We don't apply the principle of Rabbi Meir of kansu shogeg atu mezid in the drabanan. Amalcha Rabbi Meir achi hashta hasam there. In the case of dam tome, which he was zorik on the mizbeach, gavra lechaburi kamachame. Once again, like we saw before in the case of tashlume truma, here too, the Kohen had in mind to do something litova, the zrikas adam to be mechaper on the mizbeach, and not neku v'niknaseh. We're going to impose a knas. We're going to go back to the ikar din doraisa that sits as maratza. But in the case of mitami midam nasach, there he didn't do anything for the good. There was no kavanah litova and konsu shogeg otu meis toshma. Again, the same principle from a Mishnah in Trumas Perek Beis. Hama aser b'Shabbos. Now, you're not allowed to be mafresh Trumas of Maisus b'Shabbos because it's nirik Masechet Mana in the Mishnah at the end of Masechet Beitza. And he violated, and he went ahead and he was ma'aser and violated the Issa D'Rabbanan on Shabbos b'Shogeg. Is Yochal. We recognize the Afrasha, it removed the Shem Tevel, and now we can eat the Tvua. However, if he did this b'mezid, lo ye'achal. We're not going to allow him to eat it, and now we're dealing with an Issa D'Rabbanan. So we said that according to Rabbi Meir, with regard to an Issa D'Rabbanan, Kansin and Shogeg got to mezid. So how is it that here in the case of Shogeg, he was matir? I think where it says so again, the same principle over and over again. His kavanah was to be misake in the peros. He had a kavanah l'tova. We're not going to impose a knas on someone who had a kavanah l'tova. Mashen came in the case of mitame, there he was not a kavanah l'tova, and therefore kansin and shogi got to make a toshma. Again, the same principle. Hamatbil Kelev Shabbos, the Mishnah at the end of Masechet Beitza establishes that there's an Iser Tvilas Kelev Shabbos. And why is that? Because he's misakin mana, he makes the kalim usable. If he violated this Isur of and that we're dealing with the Drabanan B'Shogeg, Yishtamish Behem, he's allowed to benefit from the Tefillah and use the Kalim. But Mazid, we're going to impose a Knas, Lo Yishtamish Behem. And again, why doesn't Rabbi Meir apply the principle of Kansina and Shogeg or to Mazid B'Isur Drabanan? His kavod was the tova. He wanted to be matar his kalim, and therefore non-nekum v'niktasei. Should we impose a knas on someone who had a kavod tova? Now the Gemara goes back to ask a kasha from what we said before, that Rabbi Meir does not accept a knas of shogiyot to mezid in a drabanan. Because Rabbi Yehuda, if you remember, gauges by the chumas avera, and the avera is not a chumadik avera in the case of the rabbanon, but Rabbi Yehuda, the rabbanon. The sanya, and now we're going to have what's called a davar shebeminyan. On a doraisa level, if there's a taroves, then we apply the principle of bittul. But if on a rabbanon level, it's a davar shebeminyan, something that's counted, like eggs. You count how many eggs, a dozen eggs. Or agozim, certain types of walnuts that are counted and you pay per item. Or rimone badan, certain types of pomegranates that are counted. And the Mishnah in the third parak of Orla gives you an entire enumerated list of those things that are counted. And therefore the Mishnah establishes that if they're Orla, and it was mixed up with pairs of heter that are not Orla, they're not batal afilu be'elef, because of the chashivus of a davar shebeminyan. However, that principle of davar shebeminyan applies in the following qualification. It's got to be shleiman. If on the other hand you took these walnuts and you split them, they no longer have chashivus, and even though it's a davar shebeminyan, if they fell into a tarovus of heter, meaning a goze arla, after niftzeu, means they were smashed, then we apply the regular principle of bittul. And now we're going to learn the brisa here on Daf Nun Daled Amud Beis.